As we do on a Monday, we like to get an update. With the Australian Christian Lobby, Dan Flynn is Deputy Director of the ACL. He's back with us. Dan, a special welcome back to 2020.
That's my pleasure, Neil. Great to be here.
I might say, Dan, just in this past hour, there has been a release that's come from the chairman of the Australian Christian Lobby Board and the announcement of a new leader, a new CEO for the ACL. And lots of listeners will be very interested to hear this development. Hit us with the news.
Well, thank you, Neil. Well, I suppose it is my pleasure to announce to your listeners that a new Chief Executive Officer has been appointed to the Australian Christian Lobby, and her name is Michelle Pearce. Now, Michelle is currently in London, and her husband, John, their family, they're pastoring a church. It's a Kingdom City. Mark Baragis is the leader of the movement. They've been pastoring that church for, I think, 6 years. But prior to that time, Neil, Michelle, in her early 20s, was the Western Australian director of the Australian Christian Lobby. She subsequently worked for a Christian Member of Parliament in WA, and I think at that time also served on the board of the Australian Christian Lobby. So she's no stranger to the Australian Christian Lobby, but she's been overseas in London doing other things, pastoring a church for the last 6 years. So, Neil, we are delighted to announce that Michelle will be returning from London and coming to Canberra to be our new CEO, and we're absolutely delighted. She's very well qualified. I know Michelle personally, and you couldn't get a better appointment as someone to follow Martin Iles into the role.
Well, I saw a very brief 2-minute video featuring Michelle Pearce just before coming on air today, knowing that we were going to be making this announcement, and undoubtedly lots of listeners will want to see that 2-minute video as well and have an introduction to Michelle Pearce, the new CEO of the ACL. Dan, you say she's got a track record. She has worked in politics as an advisor to a politician. She's also worked strategically lobbying into parliaments. And this connection with the ACL, just enlarge a little bit there for us, because, yes, she's got a track record here, and some will be saying, is she going to be up to what is expected of her? Give us a thought or two here on the things that she's been involved in.
Well, a couple of things during her tenure in WA. She was instrumental in working with other groups to oppose prostitution legislation there, and her good lobbying, along with others, basically slowed the process down so much that a bill that actually passed the Houses of Parliament for some reason never received the royal assent. So they got that bill derailed beautifully. The other thing that Michelle did, which was really groundbreaking, was that before a Western Australian election, she was able to secure the attendance of the Premier and the opposition leader into a Make It Count event. And what that was all about was they both were able to make their pitch to the Christian audience. And Michelle doing that I think she was about 23 at the time. That then set a template for what we around the country, including prime ministers and opposition leaders and premiers and opposition leaders in various states, duplicating what Michelle did in WA about getting the top leaders together. So Michelle's got a lot of favour on her life. She has a lot of influence. She's has a very straightforward approach that she would say this. Her simple philosophy is that we are here to do good deeds, to be the light of the world, and in a very uncluttered way, is on the mission for Christians in politics. So she'll bring a lot of graciousness to the role, Neil, and we'll build on the great work of Martin Iles. So, yeah, very encouraging.
She is still a young woman, and I say that. She's married. She has 3 children, but she certainly has the sort of image that people perhaps expect and certainly for a younger generation who are becoming very politically minded, interested in some leadership that's coming from the Australian Christian lobby around all of these different issues of ethics. What are your thoughts here for the way she presents herself?
Look, as you say, yes, it's we've got someone who's very youthful, who's a woman, and these in politics, this confounds the opposition who think, perhaps the Australian Christian lobby are, they're all older men, slightly out of touch, but no, Michelle is very in touch. Also being pastoring for the last 6 years, she sees things from the perspective of a church minister. I think that will definitely strengthen our church bonds. And so, Neil, I've been here for, I think, now 4 CEOs or managing directors, Jim Wallace, Lyle Shelton, Martin Isles, and Michelle Pearce. And Michelle is going to build very well on the work of the previous managing directors. And I must say, as a staff and the supporters who are getting these emails today, very thrilled. And I know we've put something out on Facebook as well. And may I take a moment, Neil, to obviously honour the great work of Martin Isles. Martin is going to go on to, an amazing ministry, either here or overseas. And we all know that Martin is a, really great gospel preacher, a great influencer. So he's going to go on to some really great things, and we will all be celebrating that. And so, it's very important that we honour Martin, who's outgoing, and we honour Michelle, who's incoming.
I think everyone listening to the conversation has that special place in their heart for Martin Isles, honouring him 5 years at the helm, CEO in the Australian Christian lobby, knowing that there is a bright future before him as still a young man and with a gospel-centric focus, exciting things there. I just reflect that, when the departure came and Martin was going one way, and in some sense the ACL board was then left looking to fill a significant void. I wonder if you've got any thoughts here, because the board are obviously very prayerful about who they might appoint as a successor. Have you got any insight here, Dan, into the challenge that's been before the board to prayerfully consider and to appoint someone that they believe is God's choice to build on that wonderful foundation that Martin has left there?
Well, I think I do have some insight. The board are very prayerful, and I know that Michelle only sort of came to light after Martin's departure, and Jim Wallace, he obviously he knows Mark Varagese, and he knows Michelle, and so subsequent to Martin's departure, conversations began. So Michelle has been in conversation, obviously, with the board, and the support is very strong, and the prayerfulness is very strong. And these types of roles, they're not competitive roles; they're prayerful roles. And so you only want someone in for whom it is really God's will. It is a real calling, and I certainly, I think we are all thrilled by the way she was selected and the board's decision in this matter. So, great teamwork all around.
Well, it's like a unique Christian leadership position, isn't it? To be at the helm, the CEO of the Australian Christian lobby. It's not like being a church leader. It's not like being a teacher. It's not like being a pastor. This is very much a position where influence and lobbying and those ethics from the scriptures are going to come to the fore. And so clearly she's got some runs on the board, and there'll be an exciting time ahead. I'm anticipating that there's a fair bit of excitement around your team and the ACL in the office today, Dan. Any thoughts here? How have people been reacting?
Oh, no, the people are very energised, Neil, and we are starting a staff retreat tonight for a couple of days, and Michelle will actually join us by Zoom for a live discussion, I think tomorrow. So great anticipation. And, I think it's just great to hear someone who's so young, so articulate, and this will really unite and galvanise our staff and our supporters. So we're pleased to be celebrating this great day with you, Neil.
And I'm sure that every listener, and especially those who've been supporters of the Australian Christian Lobby, and some will have been waiting to say, will I continue my support? Well, this will be an opportunity for listeners to get behind the ACL as there is a new page turning, a new chapter beginning. And Michelle Pearce, the new CEO of the Australian Christian Lobby. Hey, there's some other things on the agenda I'd love to keep talking about, Michelle, but let's touch on a few things. Some listeners might be thinking, well, there was the Aston By-Election in Victoria. What were your thoughts on the outcome?
Well, it's an interesting one, Neil. We had a swing 6.3% to Labor. So that's the first time that the government has won a seat off the opposition in over 100 years. And so we had Mary Doyle from Labor, who defeated Rashina Campbell, who was Liberal. And the Liberals were holding the seat by 11% before last year's election. At last year's election, there was a margin of 2.9. Liberal favoured. Now it goes to Labor. Here's the point I'd make, Neil, is that, and it's a sad point to make, to be honest, that neither of these candidates really connected with the Christian constituency, and we were disappointed about that. There was a Baptist church that was to host a forum, but neither of the candidates wanted to address the forum, and so it was cancelled. Now, the point I'd make about that, Neil, is this, is that on social issues, and this is a wider concern, it seems that while once, back in the 1940s, probably to the year 2000, both sides of politics had common positions on social issues. They believed in the family, they believed in traditional marriage. Labor and Liberal were united on that. Between about probably, the year 2000 to the year 2020, Liberal and Labor were different on those things. Liberal could generally be relied upon to be, protective of Christian freedom, pro-life, and Labor were, LGBT, pro-abortion. The concern, the trend that we feel now, and we see it a bit with the Aston By-Election, is that both Liberal and Labor seem to be the same on the social issues, but the wrong way. Their LGBT is a priority, abortion is a given, and the protection for faith-based schools seems to be flimsy from both sides. So the point I make is this, is that the Liberal candidate wouldn't accept the invitation to come to the Knox Baptist Church in the electorate, because I think, she and those who managed the campaign were afraid there'd be some question on LGBT that would, upset the campaign or get a headline in the Age. And so they just weren't willing to be seen or heard on that or on Christian schooling. So I think the Christian constituency, which is, as Michelle Pearce says, the most organised, unified constituency there is, was ignored in that election. And Rashina Campbell from the Liberal Party could have engaged the Christian community, and that could have potentially changed the outcome. On paper, they had some good policies, but she wouldn't speak to them. So I'm sorry to be negative, Neil, but there's just a concern that Liberal and Labor are on a unity ticket that's, worryingly pro-LGBT, pro-abortion, and don't really want to speak about faith-based schools during an election.
And I think there'll be some listeners who will have caught something deeper in what you are saying there, Dan, that when candidates avoid addressing a Christian constituency, they ought not to be surprised when those thinking Christians look for an alternative place to put their vote. It doesn't matter what side you're on, whether you're on the Labor side or the Liberal side, avoiding the Christian constituency is going to increasingly mean that Christians will look for another place to put their vote. Now, interestingly, I did catch a short interview with Peter Dutton who, of course, is under pressure now that the Liberals have lost this. And now this sort of stuff doesn't ordinarily happen, hasn't happened for a century where an opposition has lost a seat like this in a by-election. But he's saying there's no likelihood of the Liberals changing at all. And if you read into that, this thought of being on the same page as progressives, not changing, well, there might be, a big wake-up call coming for him too. Thoughts here on Peter Dutton and where he's at with all of this?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, if they're just so similar to the Labor Party for Conservatives and for Christians, then there's just a complete lack of enthusiasm. And I think there can be a lack of definition and, if you like, perhaps a lack of appealing to Christian conservatives. And, so it's a personality thing. People say, well, do I like Prime Minister Albanese as a person, or do I find Peter Dutton more appealing? And so, the Prime Minister is on a honeymoon. He's on a honeymoon, New South Wales election, Aston By-Election. The Voice is up and running without much opposition because he's a very likeable person. And that's kind of the test. It's an emotional test. And disappointingly, these leaders and these campaigns don't get down in the weeds enough about what are the real policies that are going to affect people.
One more issue before I let you go. A lot of people will have been following Mark Latham's very controversial statement, a tweet that he put out after the election last weekend. Inappropriate comments around homosexuality. What's the ACL position on Mark Latham's comment there, Dan?
Well, insofar as I can articulate one, I haven't seen the tweet. I have read a couple of articles and so forth about this, and obviously I've spoken to Mark before the election, not subsequently. So look, it appears that he's said something inappropriate. He's obviously thought so himself. He withdrew it, I think 3 hours later, and has been sort of chastised by his leader, Flynn Hanson. So I don't know what he said, and I can't illuminate the listeners. But what I would probably ask people to consider is that in terms of a conservative voice who defends Christianity in the upper house in New South Wales, Christians actually have no better friend than Mark Latham, and that he defends parental rights. He wants gender ideology removed from schools and opposes these so-called conversion laws in New South Wales. So whatever Mark has said hasn't been right. Let's extend some forgiveness to him, and it might be a good time for people to reach out and support, encourage, and pray for him. I'm not condoning the comment. As I say, I don't know what it was, but he appears to have made a mistake in this instance. But Mark Latham is a champion for Christian values in the upper house of New South Wales.
Interesting, isn't it? Because here you have someone who says they're not a Christian, so separated from the faith aspect, but as you say too, Dan, perhaps no better friend that Christian policy has by way of someone who will at least stick up for those things which are, in some sense, common sense. We might even tie those back to a biblical foundation. So he's not afraid to fight back. When he's criticised, he's even said he'll double down, and the criticism might be even harsher and truer than the criticism against him. And so I'll leave it to listeners to make their own position on the tweet that he made, and we won't be repeating what the tweet is on this program, but for listeners they can certainly find what that tweet was by looking at various reports. Hey, we've run out of time, but always great getting your insights, Dan Flynn. And Michelle Pearce, the big announcement today, a new CEO has been appointed by the Australian Christian Lobby. Michelle Pearce will replace Martin Iles. Big shoes to fill, but some excitement for the future now under a woman who's been living in the UK, who's well experienced, a former state director for the ACL in Western Australia. For listeners, no doubt there'll be some sort of official statement on the ACL website. Let me point listeners to acl.org.au. That's the Australian Christian Lobby website. Bright days ahead. acl.org.au. Dan Flynn is Deputy Director of the Australian Christian Lobby. Dan, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
That's my pleasure, Neil. Thank you and God bless.